Oxford, England. For over 1,000 years, this city has stood at the crossroads of power, knowledge, and rebellion. Kings have made it their capital and fought wars for its control. Students have debated in its halls while armies camped outside its walls. This is a place where the future of England was decided, where minds were shaped that would go on to change the world, and where ordinary people lived, suffered, and built something that would outlast empires. Today, using advanced AI visualization techniques, we can transform centuries-old engravings, manuscripts, and faded photographs into vivid, lifelike scenes, bringing Oxford's remarkable past to life in ways never before possible. We are going to walk through every century of this city's existence, from a muddy river crossing used by farmers and their oxen to one of the most famous university towns on Earth. Along the way, you will see triumph and tragedy, genius and brutality, plague and rebirth, saints and kings, poets and scientists. Long before it was synonymous with scholars and spires, Oxford was simply a crossing point on a river, chosen for entirely practical reasons that had nothing to do with learning at all. It became a fortress, then a battlefield, then, almost by accident, the intellectual
capital of an empire. No single plan produced the Oxford we recognize today. It was built, argument by argument, riot by riot, fire by fire, over more than 1,000 years. This is the complete story of Oxford. Let's begin at the beginning. Not many people know this, but Oxford's story actually begins before the Saxons ever arrived. Archaeological evidence uncovered beneath the modern city reveals a small Roman settlement here, complete with a pottery kiln and workshops. In 2003, excavations in the city unearthed Roman pottery dating back to around 100 AD, proof that people were living and working on this site nearly 2,000 years before the university existed. But the Romans never built anything monumental at Oxford. There was no fort, no villa, no temple of note. They came, they fired their kilns, they traded their wares along the river, and eventually they moved on. Oxford was a footnote in Roman Britain, not a headline. The real story of the place we now call Oxford begins with the Saxons, centuries later. The name itself tells you everything. Oxford means exactly what it sounds like, a ford where oxen could cross. Sometime around the 8th or 9th century, Saxon farmers and settlers needed a reliable way to move their livestock across the River Thames. They found a shallow crossing point close to where the Thames, known locally as the Isis, meets its tributary, the River Cherwell, not far from where Folly Bridge stands today. It was practical, nothing more. A handful of houses appeared on the riverbank, then a handful more. The settlement became known in Old English as Oxenaforda, the ford of the oxen. But Oxford's spiritual foundation is said to come from a Saxon princess named Fridzwide. According to legend, around the year 727 AD, Fridzwide was a young noblewoman who refused an arranged marriage to a local king, choosing instead to dedicate her life to God. She is said to have fled into the forest to escape her unwanted suitor, and upon her prayers being answered, she founded a small religious community on the site where Christ Church Cathedral stands today. Whether every detail of the legend is historically accurate matters less than what it produced. Her priory became Oxford's first significant religious building, and Fridzwide herself became the city's patron saint, a status she still holds. The community she founded would, in various forms, endure for centuries, eventually evolving into the cathedral that anchors Christ Church College. By the early 10th century, things were becoming considerably more serious. England was being carved apart by Viking invasions, and Edward the Elder, King of Wessex, recognized that this humble river crossing had real strategic value. Around 911 AD, he fortified the settlement. The Elder, King of Wessex, recognized that this humble river crossing had real strategic value. Around 911 AD, he fortified the settlement, transforming a simple ford into a defended burh, part of a chain of fortified towns protecting Wessex and Mercia from Danish raiders. Oxford now sat directly on the frontier between Saxon and Viking territory, and that tension would define its earliest recorded history. In 1002, that tension exploded into horror. King Athelred the Unready, fearing treachery from Danish settlers living among the English, ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. On the 13th of November, English communities were commanded to kill the Danish men living in their midst. In Oxford, terrified Danes fled for sanctuary into St. Friedeswide's church itself. The townspeople, unwilling to let them escape, barred the doors and set the building alight. Everyone trapped inside burned to death. Among the dead, according to the chronicles, was Gunhildi, said to be a relative of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Whatever the exact truth of that detail, the massacre helped ensure that Sweyn would return to England with a devastating invasion force, and Oxford, a border town of a few hundred souls, had already found itself at the center of national catastrophe. Oxford survived, and as the 11th century wore on, this rough frontier settlement was about to be swept up in the single greatest invasion in English history. 1066 arrived, and with it, William the Conqueror. Oxford, sensibly,
Submitted to William without a fight, but submission did not mean trust. Within 2 years of the conquest, William ordered the construction of Oxford Castle, a formidable motte and bailey fortress designed to intimidate the local population and control the surrounding countryside. Robert D'Oyley, one of William's most trusted knights, oversaw its construction. The message could not have been clearer. Norman power was here to stay, carved into earth and stone.
the castle's surviving structure, St. George's Tower, still stands in Oxford today. It was never ornamental. It was a weapon, a symbol of occupation looming over a resentful town. The Normans confiscated Saxon land, redistributed property among their own nobility, and imposed their language, their laws, and their administration on a population that had little say in the matter. But something unexpected began to grow in the shadow of that castle. By the early 12th century, scholars started gathering in Oxford. No one can pinpoint the exact moment formal teaching began, but by the 1120s, there is documented evidence of lectures taking place in the town. Why Oxford, of all places? Partly because it sat at a convenient crossroads for travelers. Partly because the church already had a strong presence here, with clergy able to teach and house visiting clerks. In 1129, Ozeny Abbey was founded just outside the town walls, adding further weight to Oxford's growing reputation as a center of religious life and learning. Then, in 1141, civil war tore England apart. The conflict, later remembered as the Anarchy, was fought between Empress Matilda and King Stephen over who held the rightful claim to the English throne.
Oxford, sitting squarely between the rival factions' territories, became a battleground. Matilda seized Oxford Castle and held it against Stephen's forces. In the freezing winter of 1142, Stephen laid siege to the castle. For roughly 3 months, Matilda's garrison held out against starvation and bombardment. But eventually, the situation grew desperate. On a bitter December night, with the Thames frozen solid, Matilda and a handful of companions are said to have escaped the castle dressed in white cloaks to blend with the snow, slipping across the frozen river under cover of darkness and fleeing on foot to the safety of Wallingford Castle. It remains one of the most dramatic escapes in medieval English history, and it happened here, at Oxford. Contemporary chroniclers describe the desperation inside the castle in vivid terms. Garrison rations reduced to almost nothing, the well water fouled, and Matilda's men reduced to eating horses to survive the winter blockade. The frozen Thames, usually an obstacle, became her only route to safety, and the plain white cloaks worn by her small escape party were said to have been sheets torn from the castle's own beds, improvised camouflage against the snow-covered fields stretching toward Wallingford. The next morning, the castle surrendered to Stephen. He took the city, but Matilda herself had slipped through his fingers. The war dragged on for another decade in a brutal stalemate, with neither side able to land a decisive blow. Eventually,
Exhausted, the two sides negotiated a compromise. Stephen would keep the throne for the remainder of his life, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit it upon Stephen's death. Matilda had come within a sword's edge of the English crown, but it was not to be. England would not have a crowned queen ruling in her own right for another 411 years, until Mary Tudor took the throne in 1553. Even through those years of siege and chaos, scholars had kept quietly arriving in Oxford. With peace restored under Henry II, their numbers began to swell. The true catalyst came in 1167, when Henry II, embroiled in a dispute with the King of France, banned English students from studying at the University of Paris. Those students needed somewhere new to go, and many of them chose Oxford. What had been a trickle became a flood. Informal teaching arrangements, once scattered across rented rooms and parish churches, began to solidify into something more permanent and organized. Oxford was quietly becoming a university town, though no one yet used that word. By the close of the 12th century, Oxford had survived Roman indifference, Saxon settlement, Viking terror, Norman conquest, civil war, and royal siege. But its single most important transformation was only just beginning. The 13th century is when Oxford stopped being just another English market town and became something genuinely unique in the world. Students and scholars were now everywhere, crowding into lodging houses, packing rented lecture halls, and, all too often, brawling violently with the local townspeople. The tension between town and gown ran deep and would define Oxford's civic life for centuries.
In 1209, a scholar was accused of killing a local woman. The enraged townspeople retaliated by hanging two of the scholar's colleagues who had nothing to do with the crime. In protest, a large number of scholars packed up their books and abandoned Oxford entirely. Some of them traveled north and settled in a market town on the River Cam, founding a rival institution that would become the University of Cambridge. The rivalry born from that walkout endures to this day. It was during this century that Oxford's first colleges emerged. University College, Balliol College, and Merton College all lay claim, in one form or another, to being the oldest, each tracing its founding to the 1260s and 1270s. These colleges represented a genuinely new model for education. Self-governing communities of scholars, bound by their own statutes, sustained by their own endowments, offering permanent institutional support rather than depending on the whims of individual traveling teachers. It was, in its quiet way, a revolutionary idea.
But Oxford was rarely peaceful. In 1248, a riot broke out so severe that the fledgling university suspended its operations entirely. Clashes between scholars and townspeople recurred throughout the century, fed by genuine grievances on both sides. Students frequently enjoyed exemptions from local law, drove up rents on lodging and food, and behaved, in the eyes of many locals, like a privileged and unaccountable elite. Ordinary Oxford residents, working hard for a living, resented watching arrogant young scholars treat their town as a playground, with no consequences. By 1284, Merton College had established what is often regarded as the first properly formalized academic structure in England: resident fellows, written statutes, and an organized curriculum. Other colleges quickly copied the model. Exeter College followed in 1314, Oriel College in 1326, and Queen's College in 1341, each founded by a bishop, a chancellor, or a royal chaplain, hoping to secure prayers for their soul in exchange for endowing a community of scholars. The University of Oxford was no longer merely an idea passed between wandering teachers. It was now a physical reality, built in stone, reshaping the character of the
Daily life for a medieval Oxford scholar was nothing like university life today. Students, some as young as 14, lodged several to a room, rose before dawn for services, and attended lectures delivered entirely in Latin. Books were so rare and expensive that a single volume might be chained to a library desk to prevent theft. Discipline was harsh, corporal punishment routine, and a scholar caught fighting, gambling, or drinking too openly could be expelled outright. And yet, within these austere conditions, Oxford was quietly assembling the intellectual machinery, structured colleges, formal disputations, examined degrees that would eventually be copied by universities across the world. Then, in the 14th century, something arrived that was far worse than any riot.
The 14th century was not a century in which anyone would have chosen to live in Oxford. In 1348, the Black Death reached English shores, and by 1349, it had reached Oxford itself. The plague killed indiscriminately. Scholars, townspeople, monks, and merchants alike. Modern estimates suggest that somewhere between a third and half of Oxford's population died within a matter of months. Entire households were wiped out. Bodies piled up faster than gravediggers could bury them. The young university itself nearly collapsed for lack of both students and teachers left alive to fill its halls.
Only a few years later, disease gave way to violence. On the 10th of February, 1355, St Scholastica's Day, 2 students drinking at the Swindlestock Tavern complained loudly about the quality of the wine. The landlord argued back. Insults were traded, then punches. Then the students hurled their drinks in his face. What began as a tavern squabble spiraled catastrophically out of control. For 3 days, Oxford descended into open urban warfare. Armed townspeople attacked scholars with swords and longbows. Scholars fought back with whatever weapons they could improvise. By the time the violence finally burned itself out, an estimated 63 students and 30 townspeople lay dead. Across medieval Europe, plague and
Riot were rarely isolated from each other, and Oxford's experience of the 14th century fit that grim pattern precisely. Fear bred suspicion. Suspicion bred resentment, and resentment, once the initial shock of mass death had passed, found an outlet in the oldest rivalry the city knew: town against gown. Chroniclers of the period describe church bells ringing continuously across Oxford's parishes as the death toll mounted through 1349, and mass graves being dug on unconsecrated ground once the churchyards themselves ran out of space. It is against this backdrop of raw, recent trauma that the Swindlestock Tavern argument, 6 years later, escalated so catastrophically fast. A city that had already watched roughly half its population die in a matter of months?
Henry VIII's break with the Church of Rome in 1534 threw Oxford, a city deeply and historically entwined with Catholic monastic life, into genuine turmoil. Monasteries across the region were dissolved, relics destroyed, shrines stripped of their gold, and scholars forced to publicly choose sides in a dispute that could cost them their livelihoods or their lives. Oxford's own religious houses, including Osney Abbey and Rewley Abbey, were demolished, their stone quarried and repurposed for new secular and academic buildings rising elsewhere in the city. Then, England's first crowned queen, Mary I, arrived on the throne, determined to violently reverse her father's religious revolution. In 1555 and 1556, Oxford became the site of some of the most infamous executions in English history.
Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, along with Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, were burned at the stake for heresy on what is now Broad Street. Their deaths were intended to terrify Protestant England into submission. Instead, they became martyrs whose executions helped galvanize the Protestant cause. A tall Victorian memorial, the Martyrs Memorial, was later erected near the site, and it still stands today as a monument to the Protestant dead of the English Reformation.
Not every story from this turbulent religious century ended in flames. In 1525, before the Reformation had even fully begun, the immensely powerful Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister, founded Cardinal College on the site of the old St Friedwide's Priory, intending it to be the grandest college Oxford had ever seen. When Wolsey fell spectacularly from royal favor in 1529, his unfinished college was seized by the crown. Henry VIII eventually refounded it in 1546 as Christ Church, combining college and cathedral within a single unique institution,
still governed today by a dean rather than a master, a quirk of its unusual double origin as both a place of worship and a place of learning. Oxford had survived plague, riot, and fire, but the coming century would test the city and its university more.
Two remarkable institutions, both born in this same turbulent century, would go on to shape Oxford's identity for the next 400 years. In 1602, the diplomat and scholar Thomas Bodley reopened and dramatically expanded the university's near-derelict medieval library, insisting on strict rules against removing books and negotiating an agreement that a copy of nearly every book published in England would be deposited there. The Bodleian Library, as it became known, grew into one of the largest and most important research libraries on Earth, a role it still holds today. Then, in 1683, the Ashmolean Museum opened its doors on Broad Street, built to house the curious collection of Elias Ashmole. It is widely considered the first purpose-built public museum anywhere in the world, open not just to scholars, but to any respectable visitor willing to pay a small fee, decades before the British Museum in London even existed. The 18th century became Oxford's golden age of intellectual achievement. The university produced some of the most consequential minds in British history. John Locke's writings on governance, natural rights, and liberty spread far beyond England, helping to inspire revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Adam Smith studied at Balliol College before going on to write The Wealth of Nations, the founding text of modern economics. The astronomer Edmund
Halley became civilian professor of geometry at Oxford and successfully predicted the return of the comet that now bears his name. New colleges continued to appear on the city's map. Worcester College was founded in 1714, rising on the site of the earlier and much poorer Gloucester Hall. The city's streets were paved, new bridges were constructed, and civic infrastructure steadily improved. Oxford was no longer merely a medieval relic clinging to its past. It was quietly becoming a modern city. The physical city was expanding too. The Radcliffe Camera, now one of Oxford's most photographed and iconic buildings, was completed in 1749. Designed by the architect James Gibbs and funded by a bequest from the physician Dr. John Radcliffe, its striking circular form was unlike anything else built in England at the time. It became a reading room of the Bodleian Library, one of the oldest and most important libraries in Europe, and stood as a physical symbol of Oxford's enduring commitment to scholarship. Yet, for all its brilliance, the university remained deeply conservative and exclusionary. Religious tests barred anyone who was not a member of the Church of England. Catholics, Protestant dissenters, and Jews were shut out entirely. Women were barred from attendance altogether. The curriculum remained rigidly focused on classical languages and theology, while the natural sciences were largely dismissed as a lesser pursuit. Critics of the era openly mocked Oxford as sleepy and complacent, an institution more devoted to port wine and inherited privilege than to genuine progress. Beneath the calm surface, old tensions still simmered. The town continued to resent the gown. Occasional riots still flared, though never again with the sheer bloodshed of the 14th century. The university's grip on the city's governance, trade regulation, and local politics bred quiet, persistent resentment among Oxford's merchants and working residents. As the 18th century drew to a close, Oxford stood beautiful, wealthy, and intellectually vibrant, but also deeply complacent. The coming industrial age was about to force it to change,
whether it wanted to or not. Even in this age of exclusion, Oxford was quietly cultivating traditions that survive to this day. Students were required to wear sub-fusc, dark formal academic dress, with white bow ties and black gowns for examinations and university ceremonies. Every May morning, choristers still climb Magdalen College's great tower before dawn to sing a Latin hymn to the rising sun, a tradition already well established by this period, while revelers below celebrate through the night. Rowing on the Isis and the Cherwell was becoming a central feature of college life, laying the groundwork for what would later become the famous 8-week bumping races. These small rituals, strange and specific as they seem, gave Oxford a sense of continuity that would carry it, largely unbroken, through everything the following 2 centuries had in store. The 19th century transformed Oxford from a sleepy medieval university town into a genuine industrial city. The Oxford Canal opened in 1790, linking the city to Britain's expanding national waterway network. Coal, iron, and manufactured goods flowed in. Agricultural produce flowed out. Trade boomed as never before. Then, in 1844, the Great Western Railway arrived, connecting Oxford directly to London, Birmingham, and the wider industrial world. Journeys that once took days by road now took mere hours by rail.
The railway brought tourists in unprecedented numbers. Middle-class Victorians flocked to Oxford to admire its dreaming spires and wander through ancient stone quadrangles, romanticizing the city in poetry, painting, and popular literature. But the railway also brought heavy industry. Working-class suburbs sprang up around the new station. Factories appeared where fields had once stood. Oxford's population exploded from roughly 12,000 residents in 1801 to more than 49,000 by 1901. The university itself underwent its own quiet revolution. In 1854, Parliament forced Oxford to open its doors more widely. Religious tests were gradually abolished, finally allowing Protestant dissenters and Catholics to enroll as students. In 1878, the first women's colleges were established, Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville College. Women could now attend lectures and even sit examinations, though they would not be awarded full, formally recognized degrees until 1920. Academic standards rose dramatically across the board. The natural sciences, so long dismissed, finally received serious institutional investment.
The University Museum of Natural History opened in 1860, a soaring Gothic Revival building constructed to house Britain's rapidly growing scientific collections. Meanwhile, the Oxford movement, a religious revival led by the theologian John Henry Newman, shook the Church of England to its foundations, reintroducing ornate ritual, stained glass, and elaborate liturgy into services that had grown plain and austere. Remarkably, the Tractarians associated with this movement also helped restore many of the Christmas traditions modern Britain now takes for granted. Since Oliver Cromwell's Puritan government had banned Christmas celebrations in the 1650s, the holiday had remained deliberately muted in England for generations. Through church decorations, special musical services, and organized charity events for the poor, the Oxford movement helped revive a rich, ceremonial Christmas culture. And by the 1870s, the recognizably Victorian...
The Christmas we still celebrate today was in full bloom, complete with candlelit carol services in college chapels, an image now inseparable from Oxford's public identity, even though it only crystallized into tradition during this single, comparatively recent century.
In 1896, something arrived that would reshape Oxford's economy for the next century. William Morris, a local bicycle repairman and businessman, no relation to the famous designer of the same name, founded a small motor manufacturing operation in a garage on Long Wall Street. He began with bicycles, moved on to motorcycles, and soon progressed to automobiles. It was a tiny operation at first, but it would grow into Morris Motors, one of Britain's most significant car manufacturers, and it would transform Oxford's economy for generations to come. Oxford's literary output during this century was equally remarkable. In 1862, a shy mathematics lecturer at Christ Church named Charles Dodgson took 3 young sisters, daughters of the college dean, rowing along the Isis on a golden summer afternoon. To entertain them, he improvised a story about a girl who fell down a rabbit hole into a strange and illogical world. One of the sisters, Alice Liddell, begged him to write it down. Published a few years later under the pen name Lewis Carroll,
Alice's Adventures in Wonderland would go on to become one of the most beloved and widely translated works of English literature, born entirely.
In 1823, the Oxford Union Debating Society was founded, and it would go on to host generations of students, including future prime ministers, arguing over the great political questions of the day in a wood-paneled chamber built to resemble a miniature House of Commons. In 1902, the diamond magnate and colonial businessman Cecil Rhodes endowed the Rhodes Scholarship in his will, bringing outstanding students from across the British Empire and later the wider world to study at Oxford, a program that continues to draw scholars from dozens of countries today. As the 19th century closed, Oxford stood suspended between two identities: the ancient university city of dreaming spires and the emerging modern industrial town of factories and railway sidings. The 20th century would force the city to reconcile the two, sometimes violently.
The outrage was immediate. Protests erupted. The Oxford Mail ran furious editorials condemning the barriers. Working-class organizations staged public demonstrations. But the walls remained standing for a quarter of a century. A literal brick-and-mortar monument to class division inside a supposedly enlightened university city. Only in 1959, after years of sustained public campaigning, were the barriers finally demolished, bulldozed into rubble at last. Even today, walking through Oxford, you can pass from cobbled college quadrangles into working-class terraced neighborhoods within a matter of minutes. Two worlds still not quite touching. While Oxford wrestled with these very physical divisions, something quieter and stranger was taking shape in its pubs. Every Tuesday morning throughout the 1930s and beyond, a small circle of friends calling themselves the Inklings gathered, most famously at the Eagle and Child Public House, to drink beer and read aloud from their unfinished manuscripts. Two veterans of the First World War, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both marked deeply by their experiences in the trenches, were quietly constructing entirely new mythologies in an attempt to make sense of a mechanized, disenchanted age. The Lord of the Rings, the Chronicles of Narnia, and the Screwtape Letters were all drafted, argued over, and refined within Oxford's pubs and college rooms during these unassuming weekly meetings. After the war ended, Morris Motors exploded in growth. By the 1920s, the company was producing thousands of cars every year. Models like the Morris Oxford and later the Morris Minor and the Mini would go on to become genuine icons of British motoring. Cowley grew into a distinctly working-class industrial district, a stark and visible contrast to the ancient stone streets of the university at the city center. Thousands of factory workers flooded into Oxford seeking employment. New housing estates sprang up almost overnight. For the first time in centuries, Oxford's economy began to diversify meaningfully beyond the university. Not everyone welcomed this new prosperity equally. In the early 1930s, private property developers in East Oxford built physical walls between a council housing estate and neighboring private homes. By 1934, brick barriers roughly 9 feet high, some topped with revolving spikes, cut straight through existing streets, physically separating working-class council tenants from their private housing neighbors. Residents of the council estate woke to find their usual routes to shops, schools, and bus stops abruptly blocked, their daily lives made materially harder by a wall built solely to declare them socially inferior. The outrage was immediate. Protests erupted. The Oxford Mail ran furious editorials condemning the barriers. Working-class organizations staged public demonstrations. But the walls remained standing for a quarter of a century, a literal brick-and-mortar monument to class division inside a supposedly enlightened university city. Only in 1959, after years of sustained public campaigning, were the barriers finally demolished, bulldozed into rubble at last. Even today, walking through Oxford, you can pass from cobbled college quadrangles into working-class terraced neighborhoods within a matter of minutes. Two worlds still not quite touching.
The Screwtape Letters were all drafted, argued over and refined within Oxford's pubs and college rooms during these unassuming weekly meetings. When the Second World War began in 1939, Oxford braced for bombing that never fully came. Blackout curtains went up across the city, air raid shelters were dug into college gardens, and officials seriously debated evacuating the university altogether. The Morris Works shifted once again to war production, this time manufacturing tanks, munitions, and aircraft components, with women filling the factory floor positions left vacant by men called away to fight. Oxford also became a quiet center for code-breaking and intelligence work, with academics recruited directly into government service. And in a modest laboratory at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, 2 scientists were racing against time on a project that would ultimately save uncounted millions of lives. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain worked to purify penicillin and, crucially, to develop methods for mass producing it. Alexander Fleming had originally discovered the mold in London years earlier, but it was Oxford's researchers who transformed that discovery into a genuinely usable medicine. By 1942, they had succeeded. Penicillin became the wonder drug of the war, saving countless wounded soldiers from infections that would almost certainly have killed them in any previous conflict. It stands as one of the single most important medical breakthroughs in human history, and it happened in Oxford. Remarkably, Oxford itself was largely spared from bombing throughout the war. It is often reported, though the claim remains debated by historians, that Hitler personally ordered the Luftwaffe to avoid the city because he intended to make it the capital of an occupied Britain. True or apocryphal, the fact remains that while Coventry, London, and Birmingham were devastated by German bombing raids, Oxford survived the war almost entirely physically unscathed.
Then, on the 6th of May, 1954, something remarkable happened at Oxford's Iffley Road athletics track. Roger Bannister, a medical student at the university, ran a mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds. It was the first time in recorded history that any human being had run a mile in under 4 minutes. The achievement captured the imagination of the entire world and proved, quite literally, that many assumed human limits were nothing more than untested assumptions waiting to be shattered. Bannister trained around his medical studies at Oxford, running laps at Iffley Road between lectures and hospital rounds, and within weeks of his record-breaking run, other athletes around the world began falling below 4 minutes too, proof that the barrier had always been psychological as much as physical. Through the post-war decades, the university admitted more students than ever before, including steadily increasing numbers of women and international students. In 1974, 5 previously all-male colleges finally admitted women as full members, breaking centuries of institutional tradition in a single academic year. Meanwhile, Morris Motors had merged with Austin to form the British Motor Corporation, which itself later became part of British Leyland in 1968. The company struggled through the following decades with damaging strikes, mismanagement, and fierce competition from foreign manufacturers. By the 1980s, British Leyland had effectively collapsed. The Cowley plant survived under new ownership, eventually becoming part of BMW and producing the reborn Mini. But the golden age of independent British car manufacturing was over for good.
So how does Oxford fare in the modern era? Today, Oxford is a city of roughly 165,000 people, and the university remains unmistakably its beating heart. 39 colleges now operate across the city, educating around 25,000 students drawn from every corner of the globe. Oxford consistently ranks among the top 3 universities in the world. Its alumni include 28 British prime ministers, more than 70 Nobel Prize winners, and countless other leading scientists, writers, and public figures. Stephen Hawking, Oscar Wilde, Hugh Grant, Bill Clinton, and Emma Watson are just a handful of the names on an almost endless list. The city's economy has transformed again in recent decades. The car plant at Cowley still operates, now under BMW ownership, still producing the modern Mini. But Oxford's real growth today lies in technology, pharmaceuticals, and scientific research. The COVID-19 pandemic put Oxford squarely on the global stage in 2020, when university scientists working in partnership with AstraZeneca developed one of the world's first effective vaccines against the virus. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was ultimately distributed to billions of people worldwide, saving countless lives during the worst public health crisis in a century.
Oxford's research institutions continue to sit at the forefront of global science. The Jenner Institute, closely linked to the university, spent decades pioneering vaccine research long before COVID-19 made its work famous overnight. Oxford physicists and engineers contribute to major international projects, from particle physics experiments at CERN to climate modeling used by governments worldwide. The city's growing technology and biotech sector now employs tens of thousands of people in fields the medieval founders of Merton or Balliol could never have imagined. Modern Oxford still faces genuine challenges. Housing costs have become extortionate, steadily pushing working-class families out of the city they helped build. Traffic congestion is a constant frustration. City officials continue to struggle balancing the demands of mass tourism, which brings millions of visitors every year, against the everyday needs of permanent residents. Town and gown tensions persist in new forms, now expressed through disputes over the university's enormous financial endowment, set against chronically underfunded local services.
Oxford's stone quadrangles, cloisters, and dining halls have also become one of the most filmed backdrops in the world. Christ Church's medieval hall and staircase inspired the look of Hogwarts long before any camera arrived, and the college's real architecture appears directly in the Harry Potter films. The long-running television detectives Inspector Morse, Lewis, and Endeavour turned Oxford's crime rate, at least on screen, into something wildly disproportionate to reality, while the city's spires and colleges also appear throughout adaptations of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, itself set in a fictionalized version of the very university depicted in this documentary. Millions of visitors now arrive each year, having already seen Oxford on a screen long before they ever set foot on its cobblestones. Oxford today is a living paradox, ancient and cutting edge, exclusive and increasingly diverse, breathtakingly beautiful and quietly troubled, inspiring and at times deeply frustrating. And it continues to shape the wider world in ways both profound and subtle.
From a muddy ford where oxen once crossed a shallow river to one of the most famous cities on earth, Oxford's story is one of survival, reinvention, and relentless forward motion. Its history is messy, contradictory, and deeply, unmistakably human. Much like any other city, Oxford has never been perfect, and it never claimed to be. But as this journey through its past has shown, Oxford has an enormous amount to be genuinely proud of, and it will almost certainly continue shaping the world's greatest minds for generations still to come. Every stone in every quadrangle carries a layer of this history beneath it. Roman kiln fragments under Saxon foundations under Norman fortifications under medieval colleges, and medieval colleges standing quietly beside the laboratories where 21st century scientists are still, in their own way, continuing the same 800-year project of trying to understand the world a little better than the generation before them. If you've enjoyed this journey through Oxford's complete history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the cities that shaped the world. And as always, we'll see you in the past.